Stuka Joe here. Today we'll be taking a look at this game. An Impossible War. We'll provide background about the first Carlist War, and then we'll take a look at the game's victory conditions and some examples of play. So, let's get this thing rolling. An Impossible War is a two-player block war game about the first Carlist War in Spain. This is a game designed by David Gómez Reyoso and published by Bellica 3rd Generation. David Gómez Reyoso is the designer of one of my favorite CDGs of all time, Crusade and Revolution, a strategic game about the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939. The first Carlist War was another Spanish civil war that took place in the 19th century. It was one of 3 Carlist wars. So let's talk about the background and the causes of the first Carlist War to place this game into proper historical context. The first Carlist War was caused by a combination of factors that included a dynastic dispute, profound ideological clashes, and deep-seated socio-economic tensions in 19th century Spain. In 1833, King Ferdinand VII died without a male heir, and before his death, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction, revoking the male-only Salic law. This allowed his 3-year-old infant daughter, Isabel, to succeed him instead of his younger brother, Don Carlos, and this is where the Carlists take their name. Don Carlos's supporters rejected the Pragmatic Sanction, and upon Ferdinand's death proclaimed Carlos as King of Spain and challenged the regency of Isabel's mother, Queen Maria Cristina. There were deep ideological and political characteristics that defined the conflict. The Carlists were a conservative, traditionalist, and deeply Catholic faction that advocated for absolute monarchy, as well as the preservation of the Church's authority and maintaining traditional regional privileges and laws. On the other hand, the liberals favored a modern, centralized, and constitutional monarchy with liberal reforms that challenged the old order. The conflict pitted rural, traditional communities, which often suffered from economic hardships and which resented Madrid's central authority, against the urban merchant class, educated city dwellers, and wealthy financial interests that backed the liberal government. In addition, during these times, there was economic stagnation, and Spain owed a massive national debt and was still struggling to recover from the loss of its American colonies. The liberal forces represented the established government and controlled the majority of the existing military infrastructure, including most of the regular army and cities in Spain. The Spanish army was a relatively well-armed force of around 50,000 regulars, supplemented by a large number of royalist volunteers, as well as militia and paramilitary units. The liberals also had crucial backing from major European powers such as Britain, France, and Portugal, which provided financial support and significant military aid, including the British Auxiliary Legion and the French Foreign Legion. The liberal army favored conventional warfare tactics and initially struggled against the Carlists' unconventional approach, which gave the Carlists an early advantage in certain regions of Spain. Over the course of the war, the liberal side mobilized up to 500,000 men. The Carlist forces, on the other hand, were rooted in rural traditionalist areas, particularly the Basque Country and Navarre. The Carlist army started from scratch as small, poorly armed guerrilla bands, relying on local support and conscription. The military genius of Tomás de Zumalacárregui transformed these irregulars into a disciplined royal army of up to 35,000 men in the Northern Theater by 1835. The Carlist forces were composed of rural volunteers known as requetés and a small number of foreign monarchist volunteers. The Carlist excelled at guerrilla warfare and light infantry skirmishes in difficult mountainous terrain, which allowed them to control large swaths of the countryside despite lacking the resources to capture major provincial capitals for some time. While their overall numbers were smaller than the liberals, their regional concentration and motivation made them formidable opponents. Let's take a look at the victory conditions in the game. There is a victory point track, and the victory point marker, depending on certain circumstances, will move towards the liberal side or the Carlist side. And if it is in the automatic victory point zone of one of the sides during the victory check phase, that side wins the game immediately. If it is in the decisive victory zone of one of the sides at the end of a year, the game ends and that side wins the game. Otherwise, the game progresses until the last turn of the scenario and the marker indicates who wins the game. And regardless of the position of the marker, if at any time the Carlist player controls 2 of the 4 cities on the map at the same time, the game ends instantly with a victory for the Carlist player. There are 4 cities on the map and they all start under the control of the liberals: Bilbao, San Sebastián, Pamplona, and Vitoria. Victory points are earned by various circumstances. If a player captures an enemy city, that player earns 3 victory points. If he captures an enemy town, 1 victory point. If a player wins a battle and the enemy was routed, the winning player receives 1 victory point. And also victory points are awarded by cards that are played in the game. In the game, there's also Carlist Prestige, and there's a track on the map in which the Carlist player can move forward the Carlist Prestige marker, and when it reaches the rightmost space, 1 victory point is added to the Carlists. And the circumstances in which Carlist Prestige is obtained involves sieges conducted by the Carlists of liberal cities, as well as expeditions that the Carlist player has in the rest of Spain map. But Carlist Prestige can also be decreased by the liberal player if, for instance, the liberals eliminate a Carlist expedition. The Carlist player can obtain victory points if during the victory check phase, at the end of each turn, the number of Spanish regions with level 3 Carlist uprisings is checked, and the Carlist has, for instance, 3 or 4 regions with level 3 uprisings, like here, where he would gain 1 victory point. Also, if the liberal player during the victory check has a liberal fortress in the Carlist zone, he gains a victory point, as well as if he has a liberal fortress in the Carlist refuge space of Bastan. In this example, it's the liberals' turn, and they spend 1 action point to activate their units in Vitoria. They have 7 blocks there and 2 counters. They decide to take 5 blocks, 3 of infantry, 1 of cavalry, and a supply train, and they're going to move that group of blocks. So first they have to roll to see what movement capacity that group has. And we roll 1d6. The roll is a 5. 5 movement points, but there's a modifier to the number of movement points because of the size of the group. It has 5 blocks, so there will be a -1. So it's a total of 4 movement points. They're moving along a main road, so it'll cost 1 movement point to reach Salvatierra, where there is a Carlist unit there. Now the Carlist player has to decide whether he will stand his ground there, and there will be combat during the combat phase, or he wants to attempt to evade with his unit. And in this case, he decides that he will try to evade combat. For that, he has to roll 1d6 and score higher than the number of evading units. The roll is a 3. evasion is successful and the Carlist unit moves to Alsasua. Now the Liberals continue movement. They spend their second movement point to reach Alsasua, and now the Carlist player decides that he will not attempt further evasion, so there will be combat there, a skirmish in Alsasua during the combat phase. And this is the view from the Carlist viewpoint. Notice that the sole Carlist unit is a partida unit. This is a regular force type of unit of very low value. And one of the objectives, of the purposes of these units is precisely to lure Liberal units into following them. And that would allow the Carlist player to concentrate his few elite units against other Liberal forces. Now we continue with our example of the activation in Vitoria, and now the Liberal player decides to activate the 2 infantry blocks there. So we roll on the movement capacity table, and the roll is a 3, but there's a modifier for the small size of the group. It is a 2-block group, so there is a +1 to the result. So instead of a 4, it's 5 movement points. The group spends 1 to reach Villarreal, and now the Carlist player, if he wanted, could attempt to intercept the Liberals at Villarreal with his Carlist block at Durango, but for that he would have to spend a command point, and the Carlist player decides not to do so at this time. So the Liberals continue moving. They spend another movement point, and they reach Durango. And now the Carlist player could attempt to intercept with his unit at Villaro, and also he could attempt to evade with the unit in Durango, but it will not do so. Now, we look at the units from the perspective of the Carlist. To attempt to intercept, the Carlist have to spend the command point. They do so. So now they have just 1 command point, and they have to roll higher than the number of intercepting units. The roll is a 6. Interception is successful, and the intercepting unit joins his brothers at Durango, and there will be a skirmish at Durango during the combat phase, and we will resolve that later. Let's take a look at a Carlist movement example. The Carlist spend an action point to activate Jodio, where they have 2 infantry units, and they will affect a concentration. This allows them to bring 1 unit from any adjacent space at the cost of 2 movement points for the Jodio group. So they bring the infantry unit in Sodupe and the cavalry unit in adjacent Murguia to Jodio. So they have 4 units there, and they take a group of 3 units, and they will move this group. And notice the Carlists, contrary to the Liberals, don't have to roll on any movement table to see how many movement points they receive. They always start with a base of 6, but we subtract 2 because of the concentration. They have 4 movement points left, more than enough for these 3 units to reach Orduña, and they will battle it out with the Liberals during the combat phase. Notice that the Liberals have a unit here in Almaceda, and it cannot intercept any of these moves because the moves are inside Carlist territory, which is the red tinted territory that you see here on the map. Continuing with the Carlist round, they spend another action point, this time to activate Durango. And there they have an infantry block and a field artillery counter. And they activate these units in order for them to move. They start with 6. You add 1 because it's a small group, 7, but you subtract 1 because field artillery is present. You're back to 6. They spend 2 movement points to move along the secondary road to Villaro, and 2 more to move along a secondary road to Jodio. So they have 2 more movement points to spend, and they have more than enough to reach Orduña along the main road. But you don't place these units together with the others in Orduña. These units have to await the result of the skirmish in Orduña. If the Carlists win, they will occupy the space together with their brothers. If the Carlists have to retreat, they can retreat together with the Carlist units that are fighting at Orduña. Let's take a look at a Carlist counter-march example. The Carlists have a Navarrese unit here in Irurso, and the Carlists want to move it all the way down to Calahorra in Liberal territory. The problem is that there are Liberal units blocking the way, so the Carlists will attempt a counter-march to move through Estella, which is occupied by Liberal units, but it's an eligible space because it is in Carlist territory. So the Carlists begin by spending an action point to activate Irursun. The unit there will be moving. It has 6 movement points, but because of its small size, it is increased to 7. So the unit moves to Alsasua, spending 1 movement point along the main road, and now declares that it will attempt to move by counter-marching through Estella. So that by itself, the announcement cost 1 movement point, and to be successful, the unit has to roll greater than the number of units that are counter-marching. So it rolls a die, the roll is a 4, it is successful, and now it spends 2 movement points to reach Estella through the secondary road. So it has spent 4, and now it can move through Estella, and it will move into Lerín along the secondary road. That's 6 movement points. And now it wants to reach Calahorra. It has to spend 2 movement points for a total of 8, but it only has 7, so it has to conduct a forced march. The unit moves to Calahorra and has to roll for the result of the forced march. On a 1 or 2, it'll lose 1 strength point. The roll is a 6. It doesn't lose any strength. And the Carlist have captured Calahorra, so they gain 1 victory point. And notice that the Liberals, when they conduct force marching on a 1, 2, or 3, they lose 1 strength point. Let's take a look at a Liberal disembarkation example. Only the Liberals can disembark units from ports to other ports in this game. The Carlist player is besieging the city of San Sebastian with 2 infantry units. Inside the besieged city, in addition to the garrison, there's an infantry unit and an artillery unit. So the Liberal player spends 1 action point in order to activate the disembarkation in San Sebastian. And the disembarking units must depart from a space with a port on the map of the north. And 1 or 2 units can participate in the disembarkation. So the Liberal player has 3 units in the port of Bilbao. He will take 2 of those units and they will disembark in San Sebastian, and they will be able to participate in the skirmish. However, each of them will fire with 1 less die because they just disembarked. And notice that the Carlist unit here in Guetaria cannot intercept because disembarkation cannot be intercepted, and the Liberal player is hoping to raise the siege in the city, since if neither of his units is eliminated in combat, which is improbable, then together with the infantry inside the city, they will outnumber the Carlist besiegers, and this will force them to retreat, and the siege will be lifted. Let's take a look at an example of movement between regions, and this is in the rest of Spain map. Here we see that the Carlist player has an expedition in Castile, Leon, and the Liberals have an army of 4 units in Aragon. During the Liberal player's phase, he spends 1 action point to activate Aragon, and he selects a group of 3 units and moves them to Castile, Leon. And the remaining unit in Aragon moves to Valencia, Murcia. During the combat step, the Liberal player tries to attack the Carlist expedition, but first it has to locate it. For that, he rolls 1d6 and has to obtain a final result of 6. The roll is a 3. The attempt to locate the expedition fails. However, a pursuit +1 marker is placed in the region, and any future attempt to locate that expedition there will have that +1, making it more likely for the expedition to be found. During the Carlist player's phase, he spends 1 action point in order to activate his expedition at Castile Leon. And he decides to move the expedition to Aragon, and with the movement, we eliminate the pursuit marker from the Castile Leon region. Let's take a look at an example of a skirmish, and this example originates from a Carlist movement example that we showed before. The Carlists are the attackers, having moved a group of 3 units to Orduña. Later, the Carlist moved a second group of 1 cavalry and 1 artillery unit, but because this group entered the space after the first group, it remains on the road and will not participate in this skirmish. The Liberals are the defenders, and they have 2 infantry units. Because there's a Liberal fortress in Orduña, the Liberal player could have one of the units remain inside the fortress and fight it out with the other unit, but in this case, the Liberal player decides to face the Carlist with both of his units. And this is a skirmish because one of the sides has less than 3 infantry and cavalry units. If they would have had each 3 or more such units, then this would be a full battle. So now both players reveal their units, and the attacker decides if he will play a tactical card. The Carlists decide not to do so, but the Liberals do play a tactical card, and they play False Retreat. This card gives the Liberal infantry units a +1 to their effectiveness during this skirmish. And notice that during a skirmish, there is a penalty of -1 to all units participating as to their effectiveness. So we start by having the defenders fire first. The provincial unit has a strength of 4, so it rolls 4 dice. It has an effectiveness of 1 with the penalty of skirmish penalty goes down to 0, but because of the tactical card, it goes back up to 1. And in this case, 1s are always hits anyway. 2, 4, 4, 6, no hits. Now the line infantry rolls 4 dice. It has a modified effectiveness of 2, and it rolls 2, 4, 4, 5, 1 hit. So now the Carlists have to absorb the hit, and they absorb it with their strongest unit. All units have equal strength of 3, so the Carlist player takes the Biscayan unit and rotates it, and now it has a strength of 2. So now the Carlists fire back, and they fire first with the Biscayan unit. It rolls 2 dice. It has a modified effectiveness of 1. The roll is 4 and a 6, no hits. Next, the Navarrese unit with a modified effectiveness of 2 rolls 3 dice, 1, 1, and 2, 3 hits. And the last unit has a modified effectiveness of 2. It rolls 3 dice, 3, 5, 5, no hits. So the Carlists inflict 3 hits on the Liberals, and the Liberals have to take the hit starting with their strongest unit. Both are equally strong at 4. So the provincial unit absorbs 1 hit, followed by the line infantry unit, and the Liberal player decides that the 3rd hit will be taken by the provincial unit. And now this skirmish has ended. It's only 1 round long, and we have to determine who stays and who retreats. The side that has the most infantry and cavalry unit stays, and the other side retreats. In this case, the Liberals have 2, the Carlists have 3 units. So the Liberals have to retreat, and the Liberal player decides to retreat the line unit inside the fortress in Orduña, and the provincial unit retreats to the adjacent town of Valmaceda. And now the Carlists consolidate their attacking forces with the forces on the road and place a siege marker on the defenders in Orduña. In this battle example, the Liberals are besieging Bilbao with an army of 4 blocks, as shown here, and a field artillery unit. The Liberals have 2 infantry blocks, a garrison, and a field artillery inside besieged Bilbao. It is the Liberals' turn, and they move their army at Llodio into Bilbao. And notice that the Carlist cannot attempt to evade because the space, Bilbao, is not in the Carlist zone. So there will be combat. And combat here is a battle because each of the sides has at least 3 infantry and cavalry units. So we take the participating units and place them on the battlefield display. Notice that the besieged units in Bilbao do not get to be placed in the battlefield display. They can't participate in combat in the first round. And notice that if the Liberals had moved a second group into Bilbao, and it would be in the road connecting to Bilbao, that group could not be joining the attackers in the first round, so it would have to stay on the map, but that is not the case. So we resolve the battle in the battlefield display. The Liberal player is the attacker, and he deploys 3 infantry units in the front line. Notice that he has 4 infantry units, And the 3 units that are in the front line are in brown spaces. That corresponds to rough terrain, and that is because Bilbao is rough terrain as signified by the brown coloring inside the star. So the extra unit of the Liberal player's choice is placed in the reserve box. The Liberal player has a cavalry unit, which is also placed in its corresponding box, as well as a mountain artillery unit with a strength of 1, which produces 1 artillery point, and that is signified as a wooden cube, which is also placed in the fresh box. And finally, the Liberal player places his supply train in the corresponding space of the battlefield display. The Carlist player deploys his 3 infantry units in the front line and his sole cavalry unit also. And notice that the Carlists don't have excess units to place in reserve. They place their field artillery in its box. And notice that only half of the points will be available as artillery points, rounded down because combat is taking place in rough terrain. So 1 halved and rounded down is 0. So now the first round begins. Both players can play a tactical card, starting with the attacker. The Liberal player decides not to play a card. The Carlist player plays a tactical card, Stone Walls, and this is a good defensive card, but immediately after he plays that card, the Liberal player plays an operational card, Enemy Mistake. And this card has the effect of canceling the just played Carlist tactical card. The round consists of successive activations beginning with the defender, in this case the Carlist. So the Carlist player selects a unit from his fresh front line, and it selects the Alavis infantry unit with a strength of 4, so it will roll 4 dice. Effectiveness of 3, 3s or less will be hits. 2, 3, 6, 6, 2 hits, and the firing unit goes to the spent row. And now in a battle, the hits are freely applied by the player that receives them, and when the shots come from enemy infantry, friendly infantry has to absorb them. So the Liberal player chooses his light guard unit to receive both hits. So it is rotated now to show a strength of 2, and because it received hits, it has to make a morale roll with a modifier of -1 to its morale rating for each hit beyond the first. So it has an adjusted morale of 8, and it rolls 2 dice, and it has to roll equal or less than the adjusted morale rating. So the roll is a 7, and it passes its morale check. Now the Liberals have to select a unit to fire, and they select the Royal Guard unit with a strength of 4, but they decide to use the artillery point that came from mountain artillery. So the cube is placed next to the firing unit, and the effect is that the unit will roll additional dice equal to the value of the artillery point. In this case, 1 more die for a total of 5 with an effectiveness of 2. And in this case, the Liberals scored 2 hits, and the unit that fired goes to the spent row, and the artillery point cube is placed in the spent box. And now the Carlist player has to select a unit to absorb the hits, and it selects the Biscayan unit. It has now a strength of 2, and it has to undergo a morale roll. It has a modified morale of 8, and the roll is a 9. It fails the morale roll, and it goes into the demoralized unit's box. And now it's the Carlist turn to fire. They fire with their last infantry unit in the front line, the Navarrese unit, with a strength of 3, efficiency of 3. 1 hit. The Liberal player decides that the Royal Guard unit will take the hit, so it is rotated to show a strength of 3, and now it must undergo a morale check. The roll is a 7, and it passes the morale check. The Liberal player activates his fresh infantry of the line unit with a strength of 4, efficiency of 2. It fires and scores 1 hit. The Carlist player applies the hit to his Alavis unit, and now it has a strength of 3, and it now has to roll for morale with no adjustment. The roll is a 5, and it passes its morale roll. It's the Carlist player's turn to activate, and all their infantry units are spent, so they must activate their single fresh cavalry unit. However, the Carlist player prefers to wait to see what his opponent will do and decides to pass, and a player that passes can no longer activate any of his units in the battle round, they can only countercharge with fresh cavalry. So now the liberal player activates their last fresh infantry unit with a strength of 2, efficiency of 2, and it scores no hits, and it is placed in the spent row. The Carlist player has passed, so it's the liberal player's turn once again. They only have one fresh unit, the cavalry of the line, so the liberal player decides to have that cavalry unit charge a Carlist infantry unit. And the Carlist player now chooses to countercharge straight away with his fresh cavalry unit. So the liberal charge against Carlist infantry is cancelled, and both cavalry units will face each other. When a charging cavalry unit faces a countercharging enemy cavalry unit, both units attack simultaneously, and firing hits and morale rolls are resolved at the same time. So both players roll now. The liberal player will be rolling 3 dice, and the Carlist 2 dice. Efficiency is 2 on both sides, and each of the sides score 1 hit. So now the Carlist unit has 1 point of strength, and the liberal unit 2, and now they have to roll for morale, and there's a penalty for the Carlist unit because when you have only 1 point of strength, your morale is reduced by 1. So the Carlists roll a 4, they pass their morale check because their morale adjusted is 8, and the liberals also pass their morale check. The battle round has finished because the Carlist player has passed and the liberal player has no fresh units remaining in the front line. Now it's the end of battle round, and first, voluntary retreat. The players may abandon the battlefield with the attacker deciding first. The liberal player decides that he doesn't want to retreat, so now the Carlist player decides to retreat, and the battle ends with a liberal victory. The loser of the battle retreats from the space, and his units can retreat together or separately to adjacent friendly spaces without using any road that the enemy used to arrive at the battle. The Carlist player decides to split his forces and retreats 2 units to Sodupe, and his other 2 units and field artillery to Guernica. He could have also retreated into Munguia and Guecho. He could not retreat to Durango because that is enemy-controlled, nor to Jodio because that is the road that the liberals used to initiate the battle. Finally, the winning player can regroup his units, moving them freely between the battle space and adjacent spaces as long as there is at least 1 unit or fortress in these adjacent spaces. And here, the liberal player, to avoid overstacking penalties at Bilbao, regroups a line infantry unit from there into Durango. Let's take a look at an example of an assault. In the combat step, the Carlist player, after resolving all skirmishes in battle, can launch assaults where there is a besieged enemy fortress. And there's a liberal fortress in Orduña which is besieged by Carlist units. And the siege did not begin in this phase. An assault cannot be launched in the same phase that a siege begins. In order to launch an assault, it is essential that the besieger, in this example the Carlists, have field artillery in the space. The value of field artillery of both sides is compared. Notice there is no artillery in the fortress, so the defending player, the liberal, has less field artillery than the Carlist, and this is important as we will see. The defending player fires with all of their units, in this case the line infantry and the city garrison, and the attacking player can fire with up to 2 units when assaulting a fortress. Notice if this was an attack against the city, the attacker could fire with up to 4 assaulting units. So the attacking player must choose the 2 units, and in this case, the Carlist player decides to choose the 2 elite units with an efficiency of 3 as the assaulting units. And after showing the units, notice that the others that don't participate remain hidden. The attacking player can play a tactical card, but in this case, the Carlist player decides not to do so. So first, the defenders fire. And in this case, the line infantry rolls 2, 3, and 5, scoring 1 hit while the garrison rolls a 4 and does not score a hit. So it's a total of 1 hit. The Carlist player now must apply the hit to one of his participating units, so he assigns it to the Navarrese unit, and it is rotated, and it now has a strength of 2. So now the Carlist player fires with his 2 assaulting units. They both have efficiency of 3 and a strength combined of 5. So they roll 5 dice, and they cause 3 hits. However, the Liberal player must apply the hits, but in an assault, the defending units have double defense. So 2 hits are needed to cause 1. So the Carlist player has actually achieved 1.5 hits. The half hit causes no loss, but it is kept for the next assault round if there's another round. So the Liberal player assigns the hit to his line infantry unit. Notice that the garrison is the last unit that receives hits. So now it has a strength of 2, and we record that there is a half hit for the next round with the marker that we placed on the board. Now, as the defender does not have equal or more field artillery than the attacker, the Carlist player, the attacker, can, if he wants, resolve another assault round. And in this case, he decides to do so. He can play a tactical card, but declines to play the card. So the defenders fire first again. The Liberal player fires with the line infantry and the garrison, but this time causes no hits. The Carlist player fires with his 2 assaulting units with efficiency of 3, 5 dice, and they cause 3 hits, which are halved to 1.5. And here is where that half marker from the previous round comes into play. And now it's a total of 2 hits. And with those 2 hits, the line infantry is destroyed and eliminated and placed in the Liberal player's reinforcement reserve, that is, their bag. An assault lasts a maximum of 2 rounds, and this assault is finished. The fortress remains besieged, and the Liberal player only has the intrinsic garrison remaining. And notice that if this garrison is eliminated for any reason, either through attrition or in another assault, the fortress will fall and will be captured by the Carlist player. This is An Impossible War, a game designed by David Gomez Reyoso and published by Bellica 3rd Generation. There are many aspects of this game that we didn't cover in this video. And this game, although it is a block game, it is a game of medium complexity. So I hope that this video has given you a good idea of the flow of the game and what the game has to offer. This is Stuka Joe, signing off for now. Thanks for watching.